My experience has been from what people have told me with a severe trauma history is they assign meaning to things like that happen. And for many of them, the meaning is, I'm going crazy. I can't let anybody know about this. One of their biggest fears are going to end up in a psychiatric hospital and go after convulsive therapy or anything. But another suggestion I make to them is that when you start having these flashbacks and these recalls and stuff like that, I like to think of it more as part of the healing process.
Mm-hmm.
That it
Very
means
much so.
that you're healing, that you're integrating into your reality, real painful realities that you maybe tried to block out of conscious awareness for many years. And when we do that, when we try and block those out of conscious awareness, we can become very effective at them. But what happens is they drain off a lot of energy that can go into creativity, socializing, all kinds of different things. So when people start getting these flashbacks, I encourage them to consider the possibility that that's part of the healing process. It really sucks because it can be scary as hell. But if we look at it as a part of the healing process, we may not fight it so much or keep it secret from other people. Okay, I think this is important to information to have. Now, this is from a study that when in both the inpatient and outpatient treatments, when I had the opportunity, I would do an interview with them, and I would be checking out these kinds of things. Now, many of them don't fit the criteria of PTSD, but they're kind of ancillary issues, and not everybody has the same ones. But Archie, if you look up at the top one, alcohol and drug addiction, now these were all traumatized people, severely traumatized people. Alcoholism and drug addiction, for the males, 84%, for the females, 73%. And what, in my career on the lecture circuit, it was important for me when I was training people in the field of alcohol and drug treatment, for them to explore and to ask the questions about, do you have a significant trauma history? Has there been domestic violence, rape trauma, war trauma, medical procedure trauma? But you can see the high rate of alcoholism there and drug addiction that goes hand in hand with trauma as they try and medicate away the effects of the trauma. And if you look down a little further at sections of time blocked out, lost days and years, for the men it was 86%, for the women it was 90%. Some people, I ask them, when do your continuous memories begin? And they'll say something like, some of them say, oh, 8 or 9 or 10. Some of them say, I don't remember anything up until I was 15 years old. So a lot of their life is missing and is dissociated away from consciousness. Now, when we look down at antisocial or extremely aggressive behavior, Archie, look at this, 90% for men, which is probably predictable, 75% for women. So in the case of domestic violence, it's not always the guy that's the perpetrator and the woman that's the victim. Sometimes those are turned around, and sometimes both people are co-participants in a violent relationship. So when you take a look down at these, we're not going to have time to cover all of them, but I just wanted to hit some of the high points. And you look down at the one on feelings of hopelessness and despair. 96% of the men, 98% of the women. I don't know if I gave these facts sooner, but let me go back up. So these are the results of interviews with 300 women, 97 men. So these were those percentages come from. So, and then you look down and feelings of contempt and self-hatred, feelings of hopelessness and despair. These are all things that may not be included in the diagnostic criteria of chronic trauma, but these are some of the other issues that come up. Look at the bottom one, a tendency to pick abusive relationships. 75% of the men, 84% of the women. So when the therapist is working with PTSD, they need to be aware that there may be all these other issues with dissociative disorders as a part of post-traumatic stress disorder, the teacher, that what they are hearing is something like this. Well, today we're going to discuss Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln was the president because it was about freeing the slaves. But you need to remember that one of the things that's really important about that period of time is that. And so they're blocking out information. They don't even hear it. And I think that many of the children, there's high probability, I think, that many of the children diagnosed with learning disabilities may in fact have learning disabilities, but they may be trauma-induced learning disabilities. That's a different ballgame altogether. So, and then we go down to, let's see, a mistrust of their own reality. 90% of the men reported a mistrust of their own reality, and 91% of the women. So this whole thing is in the workbook too, and I think Sean will have it posted on her blog. But when you go through this, and here's another one that's important, the last one, a tendency to pick abusive relationships. 75% of the men and 84% of the women. So you can look at the diagnostic criteria of PTSD and study that, and I would encourage you all to do that. You can look at this, the diagnostic criteria for dissociation. We're going to cover that today too, I believe. But here's all the other stuff that goes along with it. Now, not everybody is going to have all of these things, but they need to be screened for them. I think it's down here on outbursts of unreasonable violent rage, self-mutilation, cutting, hitting, or burning themselves. A lot of these things all go with PTSD, and they need to be screened for when people are doing an evaluation. But I'd encourage you to just kind of go through them and take a look at it, and you might be kind of surprised at all of the spin-offs that occur from chronic trauma.
One of the things that Ray and I talked about is that in the process of when you're experiencing trauma or when you're young, there are some things that occur and impact the rest of your life. And there was two quotes I really loved that Ray shared in a training many years ago. And I'd like you to just briefly explain these two things to folks, because it's a real good setup for what we're talking about today.
Okay. Well, this quote isn't mine. I mean, much of what I share is coming from research, but that's okay. But the one of decisions made and conclusions drawn from the perspective of child may remain in place forever after, unless they're examined or challenged. So imagine a decision that a child might make that's being abused. I'm bad, I'm damaged, I'm no good, I'm unlovable, and all those decisions, even 30 years later, may still be in place on some level. So understanding how some of this symptomatology comes about, this is coming about from those decisions made and conclusions drawn. So people, let me stop here, and I want to share this because I think it's very important. You can go to a therapist for the rest of your life and never really heal. Because that old phrase of physician, heal thyself, well, we are the physicians. You need to learn how to heal yourself because the therapist isn't going to do it. The best I think any therapist can do is give you information about the areas that need to be healed and help you maybe generate creative ways of healing yourself. But it's kind of a little bit like alcoholism and drug addiction. It's kind of an inside job. And it's important for the therapist to get that across to the clients, I think, that they're going to do most of the healing, which requires research. Like, for example, if it was diabetes, you'd want to know everything you could about diabetes, blood sugar levels, et cetera, et cetera. Well, PTSD isn't much different. We have to learn as much as we can about that. And the bottom one kind of sums it up, that if we choose to remain ignorant of the conditions of our existence, we may forever be doomed to be controlled by those conditions. So if people are like, oh no, the child abuse hurt me, but it didn't affect me, these things happened to me, but it didn't affect me, you might be setting yourself up for those kinds of conditions to continue to impair the quality of your existence. One of the toughest things when you're working with a client is to try and get them to grasp the concept that all events are neutral. Events don't create our feelings. Other people don't create our feelings. Situations don't create our feelings. We create the feelings. We create our own feelings, all right? So our feelings come from these four places. From our thoughts, which means that our thoughts need to be as much as possible free of any thinking that distorts reality. Okay, we'll cover a lot of that. Our thoughts, our images, they're called, and David, you might be familiar with them, they're called flashbulb memories. They just kind of go pop and they're gone. But that image is there and it causes us to have emotions, all right? Fantasies is a fun one. Think about this, about fantasy and our feelings and emotions, right? We can have a fantasy about the most wonderful sexual interlude you could ever imagine. And we could be all by ourselves, nobody else around. And that fantasy starts, and think of all the physiological changes that are created by that fantasy. There's a lot of them. And our emotions change. So we need to be careful of, like, for example, people that have been very often abused, and you'll see it in the signs and symptoms, have drastic revenge fantasies where they're beating the hell out of somebody, or they're murdering them, now when we have those fantasies, that pumps up a lot of adrenaline into our system. If we have a fantasy of being somebody breaking into our home and attacking us, that fantasy alone will increase blood pressure, it'll increase cortisol levels, it'll change our physiology significantly. The more dissociative a person is, the more fantasy prone they are, okay? Now, the other place our emotions come from is the meaning that we assign to events. Now, remember, decisions made and conclusions drawn from the perspective of a child can remain in place forever after unless examined and challenged, all right? Very often, we're assigned meaning that was appropriate in the context of the trauma. All right. So for instance, Vietnam veteran hearing a gunshot, it's like, that means somebody's trying to kill me. Well, it might mean somebody's target practicing 100 yards away. But if we assign meaning exactly the same way now as we did during the trauma, then we're going to have those similar feelings. So what, and when I ask people this question, very often they're kind of stumped by it and they're kind of shocked by it. But they'll describe an event to me and I'll ask them, well, what does it mean to you that those people rejected you? Well, it means I'm bad. It means those are all decisions that they made possibly when they were children. So our emotions don't come from events, situations, or people. They come from us. We create them. And we do it through meaning, fantasy, thoughts. So people have a hard time grasping that. And very often people have said, no, it's not. It's they piss me off. And it's like, they're not pissing you off. You're making yourself angry. Well, how am I making myself angry? And when we don't accept that our feelings are generated by us. And very often we blame other people for the feelings that we have. And that's one of the worst things you can do in a relationship.
Thank you.
Over.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about dissociation. We may not get to flashbacks till next week, but we're going to talk about dissociation. I wanted to go a little back, though, to what Ray just says, that we have things that we decide, we imagine, and we've done in the middle of trauma. And oftentimes we have this hindsight bias. We think, with all the knowledge and the years we have now, we think, oh, we should have done this, whether it's as a child, why didn't we protect ourselves, or why didn't we do this? Or in the middle of a trauma, maybe it's been a fire, or in the middle of having a really dramatic and traumatic death situation. With our hindsight bias, we say, we wish we had done this, or we should have done this. Has anybody lived in Tornado Alley, where anybody live where there's been tornadoes? Put your hand up if you have, or know anybody that's lived in tornadoes. Okay, Connie, would you, if you in that area where you've had tornadoes, or someone you live with, they built this kind of house for themselves? No. It's really, well, if you think about it, if you've lived in New Orleans where there are floods, and this is where this person built the house, it made sense that they built a house up on stilts. If then they moved over to Kansas City, Kansas area, or some of the places where there are tornadoes, and they insisted to their builder or their husband or their wife or whatever, I want a house on stilts, it would not be effective. It would be, you'd probably be questioned. It was at one time a creative thing to do. And there are many things that we've done as children or in the middle of trauma that are considered creative, and we need to celebrate it. And we need to look back at those wonderful things we thought or decided or did or imagined, or the meanings we assigned, because they were there at that time to help us keep safe. When I was a young child, and some sad things happened, I did pictures in my head. I didn't draw because my sister was the artist and I was the good kid in school. But later on, when I went to child welfare and started working with clients that were with young mothers and children and foster parents, they started telling me about all these amazing creative things they did as children to help keep their souls and sometimes their bodies safe in a really traumatic situation. And I went, oh yeah, I remember I used to draw pictures in my head. So I drew pictures, and I drew this book for them and wrote a book for them. I'm going to share a little bit of it, just a portion of it, because I want to then talk about one of the things that people do as children that helps keep them safe is dissociation, and Ray will explain that more. But I'll share you a little bit of the book. And you can imagine you're sitting at the library and the librarian's telling you a story, a picture book. So I'll give you a little piece of it. I won't read all of it. Did you know that spacing out helps us find relief? Doctors have a bigger word for it, dissociation. It's that feeling of drifting away when the present is too hard to face. Sometimes it felt like we stepped outside of ourselves or hid deep inside in a warm place when we dissociated. It was as if the abuse that happened was happening to somebody else, or we were dreaming. Our protective spirits were so smart to help us take that mind break. It made it easier for us to survive. And I'll let you look at it, read it first, and then I'm going to put the slide down so Ray can talk about dissociation, what it is, the consequences of dissociation, and then we'll talk about some grounding techniques. And the piece says it's not disassociation. I hear that television reporters do that. I want to say disassociation is not dissociation. If you're not sure, look it up. So Ray, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, so we're going to talk about dissociation a little bit. All right, this could be like about a day's class on dissociation. So we're going to crunch it all down. And I'm going to leave it to you to look up the diagnostic criteria for dissociation. It has to do with derealization, depersonalization, fragmentation of personality, all those kinds of things. And you can look those up on your own. But dissociation is primarily defensive in nature. We all use dissociation. It runs kind of on a continuum. And down here at this end, there's normal dissociation. How can, okay, it reverses. All right, I'm a little confused. But anyway, on one end of the continuum is normal types of dissociation that we all do, that we do it every day. All dissociation is disconnecting from the external world and going into the internal world. That's all it is. And so normal forms of dissociation are things like highway trance. When you're driving down the road and you're going kind of a trance state, you're performing enormously complex operations at 70 miles an hour, but you're still in somewhat of a trance-like state. So normal dissociation, highway trance, absorption. Now you go to a theater and they shut down the lights so that everything is focused right on the screen. The way that we normally dissociate is we stare at something. And then we just kind of find ourselves disconnecting from it and going from the external world into the internal world. Now, if we move further down that dissociative continuum, real problems start down here, not here at the normal range of dissociation. So let me talk to you about some of the problems with dissociation. What started out to be a survival strategy, and children learn to dissociate very young. What started out to be a survival strategy was very, very effective, but carried into adulthood, then it can have some serious consequences in our relationships and our ability to function at a high level and our ability to concentrate and listen. So let me start with dissociation in children. Right? If children get battered frequently, they develop the psychogenic ability to make their body numb. They can literally make their body numb so they don't feel the blows. The reason that when I talked earlier about children in school dissociating and hearing blah, 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 or they just see the mouth moving, think how effective that would be in a home where, unfortunately, some giant monster parent is in the face of a little boy or girl and screaming at them. They can make themselves deaf. They cannot hear a single word. It's defensive in nature. Dissociation is also defensive in nature because it protects us from a lot of different things. Like, what do we do if we're sitting in a class and lecture, or we're listening to somebody lecture, and we just find ourselves going into a trance-like state? And now we're off fishing, or we're hiking through New Zealand, or, and so it protects us from boredom. Now, I can't really tell when people are doing it on a screen, but I used to tell audiences, I can tell when you're doing that, and I'm going to call you. They don't panic. No, it's not me. So anyway, dissociation is defensive in nature. But as I said earlier, if it continues in life, and if a person doesn't have control of it, like we're driving down the highway, we're dissociated to a certain degree, but we can come out of it in a heartbeat. As soon as you hear that police siren behind you, bam, you're out of it right away. We have control of it. But in the extreme cases on the continuum, people don't have control of it. It makes it very hard to listen, and it makes it hard to listen to your loved one or to your partner. It may make it hard for listening in all kinds of different critical areas. I had a good friend of mine, went to the doctor. The doctor was giving him his diagnosis of cancer, and his wife was there with him. And I asked him how he took that, and he said, as soon as you mentioned the word cancer, my mind shut off. And it was a good thing my wife was there, because I didn't hear anything more that the doctor said. He just dissociated just like that. So it's defensive in nature. It also it helps with survival value, along with all of these other things on the signs and symptoms checklist. Although they may appear pathological, they're all about survival techniques. And that's what the trauma survivors do, is they're trying to survive, and they come up with these ways of doing it. So dissociation is on a continuum, but basically all it is disconnecting from the external world and going into the internal world. Another problem with it with PTSD, with people with PTSD, we have a tendency to isolate many times because most of us are probably more introverted than we are extroverted. Like for extroverts, being around other people and socializing energizes them. For people that tend towards introversion, it drains us. So we need to pull back and kind of regroup before we can be out. So our willingness to socialize can be diminished too. Another case of it is a woman that told me, very sadly, and she was very, very highly dissociative. And she told me that she hardly remembered years of her children's lives because she was so dissociated. She didn't even have a good handle on what was going on with her children. I've had women tell me this, that they're really angry at their mothers because their mothers walked in an incident where their father was sexually abusing them. Walked in, dissociated away from what she was seeing, and turned around and walked right back out. Because unfortunately, her mother had also been pretty badly abused. So it'll help if you have some questions about dissociation as we go along, because I can talk about it for a long time. But if you have any questions, toss them out there, because I might get sidetracked. So the other thing with dissociation is in cases of extreme trauma, we'll use dissociation as a defense. We learn as little children, especially, we learn self-hypnosis. So my way of testing dissociation in clients was I would ask them to stare at the clock. Just stare at it. And I would say, okay, is your vision tunneling down? And you'd say, yeah, my peripheral vision is tunneling down. And that's a sign that the dissociative process is starting. Now, this is in extreme cases, all right? So imagine that they're in a situation, especially for you, Archie, the ultimate, almost ultimate authority figure. You're talking to them, they're dissociating. They may not even be hearing what you're saying. And a lot of children are punished for, why don't you listen to me? And it's like, they can't listen, they're dissociating, and it's defensive for them. So any questions so far? Throw one out so it'll help me along here.
Well, one of the things I will add, it goes reflecting on what Ray talked about, because we had the same situation when he was in the doctor's office and he got a significant diagnosis. And I could look over at him and his eyes, he was like sitting there with a half smile on his face and his eyes were kind of glazed. And we came out of there and he asked me, what did the doctor say? And I explained it. And I had the same thing happen to me, and I didn't have anybody with me. What I remembered reflecting what happened with Ray is I started recording so that I would go out of the doctor's office and I would remember what the doctor said. I was at my PT off, and I actually had her film the PT exercises because I would only remember part of it. So when you are working with a client or you have someone in front of you at court, it's really important that that person is having a recording done so they're listening to it. And they get to then go back and reflect afterwards, listen to the words, and then process it, write it down. Use several different methods of hearing, learning, and processing, because oftentimes they're going to walk away with it without a real understanding. Their fear will get in the way. One of the things why I'm putting the slides and then an additional summary of this class on the blog that I send you is that you will naturally hear what's interesting to you, but you'll naturally going to only remember a small part of it. Maybe that's dissociation, maybe that's interest, but it's important that we take important information, important situations, and reflect back on them in several different ways, because we'll lose some of it. And then people think oh, you don't care, you don't listen to me, you don't help me. Oh, we get all kinds of negative connotations about our behavior. Yes, Ray, back to you.
Okay. Some other parts of dissociation that really impact relationships. And one of them is the listening. If you're in a relationship with someone with PTSD, and you're trying to communicate information to them, and they're kind of looking off in another direction and stuff. Try and get them to look eye contact with you. I think that a big part of people in therapy would come in and we'd work and they'd tell me that, oh yeah, I feel a lot better when I leave. And it's like, I don't think it was any magic that I had or any stuff. I think part of it is for that whole hour, they were focused on another human being. And it's really hard to dissociate if you're focused on another person when they're talking. But our technique when we dissociate is generally look the other way and then just drift off into a trance-like state. And it interferes it can interfere quite a bit in relationships. Okay, give me another question and I'll take off in another direction.